It is 101. So again, welcome. You are at the Sustainability and Environmental Management, Moving Beyond Climate Resiliency. We have three great speakers today. We have, in no particular order, Elliot Ruga, who is the Policy Director of the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. We have Dr. Emil DeVito, who is the Manager of Science and Stewardship at the New Jersey Conservation Foundation. And we have Winifred Victor Hines, who is the board member and executive director of Stepping Stone Resources, Inc. And I'm going to turn it over to Winifred and start the session. Just one quick sort of housekeeping. If you have questions, please put them in the question and answer. We'll answer the questions at the end. Everyone's audio is muted, so you can't jump in. And if any people have issues, please use the chat and I will try to address them. So with that, Winifred, thank you for doing this session and it is all yours.
Okay, my pleasure. Good morning, everyone, or rather good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this exciting day. I really appreciate it. So bear with me as I share my screen. Okay. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sustainability and environmental management, which is moving beyond climate resiliency. And most people don't know or give much thought to the source, hold on, I'm having a little problem, to the source of their water. And there are many challenges, especially in low income and Black and Indigenous people of color communities internationally and nationally, and they face constant water challenges. And Newark, of course, is no exception to the challenges, including toxic contamination in the water and other issues, air pollution. And Newark's water comes from the reservoirs in the northwestern mountain forest part of New Jersey, specifically the Paquonic and the Wanacue. Okay. So here we have a map of the area that I am referring to. And then just to give you a little bit of history about Newark in terms of, the water issues that it's faced throughout the years. And in 1890, Newark had the highest mortality rate in the country. And in 1892, Mayor Joseph Haynes purchased the watershed because the residents in Newark were falling ill and dying from drinking bacteria-infested water from the polluted Passaic River. They also had the foresight to protect and preserve deep forests, the brooks, ponds, and unspoiled landscapes surrounding the water's source. So the Paquonic River, it's a tributary of the Ramapo River, which in turn is a tributary of the Upper Passaic. And in 1951, Anheuser-Busch beer came to to Newark, and because of the watershed's pristine water. And at one time, there were 26 breweries operating in Newark. So you can imagine that Newark's water was much sought after. And though it had pristine watershed, Newark continued to be plagued by other environmental factors such as polluting industries, the seaport, the airports, and diesel emissions, not only from the ships and planes, but trucks as well. So, which leads to around 2004, when it was discovered that there was lead in the water fountains at various schools throughout Newark. And so this also led to, all, investigations into different homes. They tested homes and then found a whole lot of lead, but not necessarily from the watershed as its source, but because of the pipes and also the soldering. So this I won't get into because that's a whole nother discussion in to itself. So today, Newark's Pequannock water system, it serves all of Bloomfield and Belleville and some 430 homes in Nutley and all of the Pequannock Township, in addition to the western part of the city, 500,000 people at all, in all. And Newark currently owns 86% of the lands in the Pequannock watershed. Okay. Now, in 1973, there was the establishment of the Newark Watershed Conservation and Development Corp. And this was done through an ordinance that the Newark Municipal Council authorized the city to enter into a service contract for the conservation, development, and management of the watershed properties. So instead of having the city handle all these functions, the council also authorized the then mayor, Kenneth Gibson, I believe, to establish the NWCDC, which was established as a nonprofit that, pursuant to the contract, would manage the conservation. And in 1998, through a second service contract, NWCDC's responsibilities grew to include operating the city's water treatment facility and also water reservoir. Now, the NWCDC was governed by a board of trustees, right, and 2 members of the city council, and up to 8 others appointed by the mayor. And the board elects a vice chair, secretary, treasury, and then Mayor Cory Booker served as the ex-official chair. And under his watch, there was a move to privatize the city's water system and turn it into an MUA, or a municipal utilities authority. Now, the city provided taxpayer funds to the NWCDC through those service contracts, which accounted for more than 99% of the NWCDC's income since 2008. Now, there was a lot of funny business going on throughout this time. And then so around 2011, 2012, a group of grassroots activists, and I was included in the group, and we decided to form the Newark Water Group. So we fought against the DMUA, NWCDC, Mayor Booker, and then Councilman Ras Baraka, well, even before he was councilman, he joined us in the fight. He was also against the MUA. And so we had to replace another councilman with Ras in order for the vote to go our way. And so throughout all of this, there's a complete report that was released to encourage the authorities to investigate the whole NWCDC and what was going on. So there were all these lucrative contracts to different lawyers. There were consulting businesses to friends, kickbacks, lavish dinners, etc. I mean, there's also an investigative report that you can take a look at, and it goes on about the whole fight. And it really was a true David and Goliath fight. We went, in front of supermarkets, door to door. We had meetings. We educated the public about what was going on. We had sip-ins in front of City Hall where we had samples of Newark water, straight from the tap, and encouraging people, to drink it and to be mindful of the water. And then also to take into consideration, what it is that you have to do in order to maintain the water so that you don't have to rely so much on bottled water. And so finally in 2013, the NWCDC was dissolved, and the executive director, Linda Brashear Watkins, uh, she went into trial and she was indicted. And around late 2019, she was sentenced and went to jail. So the last person involved with the whole NWCDC fiasco, I think, or one of the last people, was recently indicted in February of 2019. Okay. Now, in order to get a better handle of the location of the watershed in the rivers, now if you look at the map and then you see the lower Passaic River and then you see the red outline, and then it gives you an indication of where it is. And if you look at the one on the right, and then there's a picture of the Passaic River of Newark, and if you meander down and then you follow the Passaic River, the blue line, and then it shows you the path that it takes to go into Newark and then eventually meet up with Newark Bay, right? So again, this is a better view, a more detailed view, okay? And a zoom view of the map of Newark and in the Passaic River and in the Hackensack River, and you know, the path that it takes. Now, through around 2016, I believe, right? That was a while ago, not too long ago, rather. So the EPA, because of through a court settlement with about 15 industries that had polluted the water, decided to do a site cleanup. And so if you look at the purple box, it shows the lower 8 miles of the Passaic River cleanup, and mostly in Newark, right? So supposedly it would cost like at least 1.4 billion to clean up the whole Superfund site and just the lower 8 miles of the river. So if you see also, you can see the hot spots of dioxin along the 9 miles from the North Arlington to the Dundee Dam, spanning Clifton and Garfield. So it was one of the 19 pilot locations of the Lower Passaic River, and a collaboration of federal and state agencies, municipalities, and community-based organizations in advancing the cleanup, restoration, and stewardship of the Lower Passaic River and equitable, sustainable development along its banks. And if you don't know too much about Newark's history in terms of the contaminants, I mean, Newark was, okay, it's gotten better, but still is a very polluted city. And along the Passaic River, you know, there were various industries. You had smelting, leather, all these different types of industries. And the diamond alkali and diamond shamrock industrial, produce industrial pollution, including dioxin, which is otherwise known as Agent Orange, and which is also a defoliant, I believe, and also herbicides, pesticides, PCBs, metals, and all of these, they seep into the water. So they affect the groundwater, which is found underground, and it must be pumped out, and the surface water, which is the water found in lakes, rivers, streams, oils, soils, and building structures. Now, if you look at the Lower Passaic River Restoration Project, you probably can't see it, but I'll quickly explain it. So the EPA Restoration Project divided it into different phases. And so there was also some dissatisfaction with the EPA plan, but luckily there was a lot of grassroots involvement. And groups such as the Ironbound Community Corps, the Newark Environmental Commission, and other community advisory groups, they were committed to a cleaner and healthier Lower Passaic. So the group, completed a target, was working on completing the target removal of a mud flat at the river line in Lyndhurst. And in one of the polluters, Occidental Chemical Corp, which took over Diamond Alkali, as I mentioned before, agreed to pay 165 million towards the cleanup and the court settlement, which is really not that much considering it would take at least 1.4 billion, that they have calculated. And this is another picture of the process, the phases for the sediment removal operation. And which is also plagued by, if you've ever driven through Newark when it rains, because Newark has the combined sewer system, there's a lot of flooding. And during Hurricane Sandy, which was in October 2830, around 2012, so the waterfront areas of Newark, Harney, and Harrison were, severely impacted by Hurricane Sandy. And the storm surge inundated an extensive area of highly developed industrial, commercial, and residential neighborhoods. And in Newark, around, I believe, 266 homes and around 10,000 businesses were damaged. And in Harrison, a little bit less. And Kearney had about 96 homes and 1,000 something. And also, there was damage to the path, NJ Transit, and Amtrak, who were severely impacted, and operated through this area. All right. So some community organizations involved in the Passaic River Community Advisory Group provided advice and recommendations to the EPA and the partner agencies to ensure, I would say, a more effective and timely cleanup and restoration. And, they wanted to make all the decisions in light of a long-term goal, restore the Passaic to a living river and a viable natural resource, improve the recreation and open space, and of course, protect against cross contaminants to air, the groundwater, and other environmental media. So these, if you look at the slides, these are the actual notes that were taken at these EPA meetings involving a whole bunch of other community groups. And so the current status right now, according to Lenny Thomas, who's also in one of the community advisory group, was that the final design was to take up like 2 to 4 feet of riverbed, then replaced within a cap and anti-scour layer. I won't go into the details, but the EPA, has been moving very deliberately in this area. And it's because, a lot of the lawsuits also that were involved. And a lot of these technical data, you can find them online also at allpassaic.org. And there's a resource section at the end of this presentation. So, lots of people, are not aware. So, even in Newark, they're not aware of the Highlands' existence or that Newark even owns the watershed, right? And so it's very important that for us, as community organizers, grassroots organizations, to try to make that connection, so even though the Highlands make up less than 15% of the state, it provides drinking water for 70% of its residents, which are approximately 6 million people, And so that's why New Jersey also, they enacted the 2004 Highlands Water Protection and Planning Act to protect the region's forests, farms, and waterways. And so Newark does have the obligation, and not just Newark, but everybody involved also. You know, in the state, you live in the state, you have an obligation to protect it from development, you know, make sure that, you know, the MAC mentions or hotels or whatever other developments that they have um, scheduled or they would like to do, you know, that it doesn't happen. And so one of the reasons, you know, there are many, many reasons, but one of them is that the forest acts as a natural filtration by cleaning water, and the contaminants would be a lot worse without this filtration. So it's like, you know, the biggest filter ever, you know, so it prevents a lot of the contaminants from contaminating the downstream river and also help prevent flooding. So my time, so I will just go through quickly. And, you know, we have to be more vigilant. I, you know, mentioned that. And then Newark watershed forest becoming mature. And Emil is going to talk about that also at length. And then here at the end, it's some pictures of, you know, the contamination, the pollution, you know, people helping clean it up, you know, different people in the communities who care. And then there's this annual Newark Walks to the Water. This one, I think, was in 2016. And, you know, just to get people involved and to, you know, make sure that they become good stewards of the environment and then also the water, and to educate them about what's going on, and then also make sure that they enjoy it. So quickly this, and thank you. Sorry, Elliot, I went a little bit over.
That's that's okay, Winnie. I think we're going to find that um, I'm going to end. I'm going to come at it a little differently, but end at the exactly where you ended, which will
Okay.
be great. But I think you have to stop
Yes.
sharing so I can then share.
Yeah, I was trying. Okay, here it is.
Okay. The Passaic River in New Jersey is one of the oldest populated and industrialized regions in the nation. Much of the mid to lower river basin has been under assault from the early days of the Industrial Revolution up through the uncoordinated land use decisions of later generations, such as the boomer generation. And as we see the Passaic River, it is even today, when we no longer rely on the river for navigation or the lower Passaic Basin for drinking water, we can see how so much development is hugging that river. We have gotten much better at managing point source pollution and non-point solution, and we're much better at making land use decisions. Yet, are we just scraping the surface of a legacy of land use, abuse, and pollution? For decades, we have been stressing our water, land, and our air. In fact, as Winnie mentioned, in the turn of the last century, the city of Newark had polluted the lower Passaic, the source of their drinking water, to such an extent that there were outbreaks of cholera and typhoid at epidemic levels. People were dying, that they had to go elsewhere for their water supply. They found that the Pequannock River Basin was the perfect, pristine location under 20 miles from the city to develop a series of water supply reservoirs to gravity feed to Newark. The Pequannock River is ultimately a tributary of the Passaic River. Eventually, Newark acquired 35,000 acres of land, mostly in West Milford in Passaic County, to buffer its 5 water supply reservoirs. Today, those 35,000 acres connect to a larger 164,000 acre forest, approximately 255 square miles. And this is improbably located in the more densely populated northern half of the most densely populated state. This forest is the least fragmented, most biologically diverse, and ecologically rich forests in the state, providing a wealth of resource values, from water production and protection to multiple accessible outdoor recreational opportunities. It has New Jersey's widest range of plant and animal species, many threatened and endangered, as well as air filtration, and the forest is an incredible engine for capturing and storing atmospheric carbon. Most people, even in New Jersey, have no idea that such a large single forest exists. Why? Because it is under a motley, balkanized array of ownerships: municipal, county, state, and federally owned parkland, water supply management lands, and private ownership. We cannot see the forest for its component jurisdictions. But if we look at it from the air, say, not from Google Earth or any mapping services base layer, but to fly over it from, say, a single engine plane, you can begin to comprehend the magnificence of this forest resource. For the forest and its critters, there are no jurisdictional boundaries. As valuable as this forest is to us, the high and ever increasing cost of land in northern New Jersey ensures that the pressure to develop only increases as well. Development interests, corruption, how we regulate land use in New Jersey, how we meddle with our forests, and the risks posed by climate change all will determine how much longer we have to enjoy this forest resource. If we are not careful, we will slowly impair this forest to the point it can no longer provide the water production and water protection natural services it currently provides. Because in New Jersey, we cannot outright ban pollution or absolutely protect our highest value forests from development. We can only manage it through a permitting program. Permitting programs can only slow pollution or development, making it tedious and expensive to pollute and develop. But to develop, for example, forested lands in the highly regulated Highlands Preservation Area is regularly clear-cut today through the exercising of Highlands exemptions. In spite of having the most protective environmental regulations in the country, a private property owner is constitutionally protected to ensure that they have certain rights to develop their land. New Jersey has over 5,000 written pages of land use and environmental regulations, which serves to complicate but not prohibit development. The Department of Environmental Protection under Governor Christie succeeded in rolling back protections so that headwater streams lost regulatory protections, and it is now easier to develop in flood-prone areas. The Highlands Council lost its ability to deny major development projects in the planning area that would destroy or degrade identified Highlands natural resources. And 3 years into the Murphy administration, whose transition team's priority environmental policy recommendations included reversing the Christie-era rollbacks, those rollbacks today remain in place. Climate change will accelerate the degradation of water, air, and land. As low-lying coastal areas become inundated, human migration will head to higher ground, increasing the density of population, further stressing the landscape and its resources. Low-lying former industrial areas will release legacy toxins from within its soils into the newly formed marshlands. What can be done? Well, better alliances between the traditional enviro conservation orgs, which tend to be mostly white, with urban organizations, which tend to have more people of color, by recognizing true common goals and interests. And here is one. There is an unacknowledged common goal between those who live in the coastal cities of northern New Jersey and those who strive to protect the natural resources of the Highlands, that if the focus of development activities continue in the remaining natural landscapes of the highlands and not in the redevelopment of our older cities, we will forever extinguish for good the multiple natural resource values of the highlands. And by the way, all these land transitions occurred in the highlands. If we continue to do this, we will fail at making our cities vibrant, viable, and affordable. Acknowledging this fundamental common goal to protect Highlands resources and to revitalize our cities combines the strength of our advocacy to more effectively promote these mutual goals. Another unacknowledged common goal is how the interests of the city of Newark and its residents align with the goals and objectives of the Highlands Act. The quality of life in Newark is inexorably tied to having an inexpensive and plentiful supply of drinking water for its citizens and industries, and as an asset to sell to neighboring municipalities. Protecting this forest is in everyone's interest, whether a citizen of Newark or any of the 6.2 million people that depend on Highlands water. But it isn't only the production and protection of Highlands water, it is also the availability of recreation, the great reservoir of biodiversity, and its value as a highly efficient engine for carbon sequestration. Emil, I'm almost done. I know we've got some time issues. Newark citizens, we will support forming a watchdog Friends of organization to force more transparency in the management of this 35,000 acre forest and its reservoirs, to enforce a more public process and to promote greater awareness of its resource values, as well as design compatible recreation and youth programs that utilize this forest and for use as an eco lab for environmental science and other academic areas. And we need to ensure that Newark is represented on the Highlands Council. Despite it being the Highlands' single largest landowner, it never has had a dedicated voice on the council. And we need to advocate for a New Jersey Green Amendment, a constitutional amendment that recognizes and protects the right to clean water, clean air, and a stable climate and clean environment. Until we have that constitutionally right guaranteed, we cannot infringe upon other protected rights, such as private property rights, resulting in laws that cannot outright ban pollution and the continued destruction of forests. A New Jersey Green Amendment would require better balancing of these rights. So at this point, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Emil, and see you later when we share, when we have questions.
Hi, everybody. My name's Emil DeVito, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. And I want to thank Winnie and Elliot for such a fantastic job. I think the thing that struck me most about the previous two talks are the look toward the future. Elliot showed a New Jersey flood map showing what sea level rise is going to do in the cities and in the coastal areas, and it's going to push people inland over the course of the next century. And, you know, we already don't have room in New Jersey to do all the things that we need to do to preserve our environment and make our cities livable and accomplish all of the different intertwined goals. So there's going to be tremendous assault on our forest. The forests, of course, were assaulted the first time starting about 400 years ago. Almost all of the forests of New Jersey were cleared in the first 150 years of colonization. but most of them grew back. A lot of them were converted to farmland. This map is from the late 1800s, showing in green all of the land that had not been converted to farmland. And you can see that, originally all of this would have been forest, almost all of it. And after colonization, much of the forest was cleared. But notice in Morris and Passaic counties, you have that Highlands Forest area that Elliott so carefully mapped for you. And much of it remained in forest and was not converted to farmland, mostly because of the bedrock and the infertility of the mountainous slopes. And that was really lucky for Newark, right? Because when they needed a water supply, when everything became polluted closer to the coast, they turned to the highlands and created the Newark watershed. And in the subsequent century and a half, they've been fantastic stewards of the land. It's some of our oldest forest in not only in the highlands but anywhere in New Jersey. It has grown back. This is the close-up of that map. It's the same area that Elliott showed you from other views. The reservoirs of the Newark watershed are centrally located here in the map. And you can see the white areas were valley floors that were converted to farmland. Now, in the last century, they all grew back into forest as people migrated into the cities after the Industrial Revolution. And so if you look here, you can see Clinton Reservoir in the 1800s, surrounded by forest, but lots of farming in the valleys. But then if you look today, you can see that much of the white areas have grown back to forest. And of course, yes, on the right-hand side or eastern side of the modern photo, you can see some suburban development, some residential areas. But for the most part, that Newark watershed and the Highlands Forest is largely intact. And there's a big difference between the forest that was never converted to agriculture and the forest that has grown back over the last century. So we really have two kinds of forest, and they're both important. But the forest that was never converted to agriculture is really special. It houses tremendous biological diversity. The soils are intact. They filter water. They sequester carbon to fight climate change better than the lands that were converted to farmland at one point in time. The streams and the wetlands, here's the same area again. Clinton Reservoir is in the lower center. You can see the yellow streams are Category 1 streams coming through the Newark watershed. All the blue is wetlands. And so these are all headwater areas that Elliott mentioned. The protections have been weakened during the Christie administration. But thankfully, much of these lands are in the Newark watershed or on state-owned or county-owned parklands. And right now, they're not threatened by development. That's not to say they won't be threatened in the future. Newark has done an incredible job fighting off various, many times that development proposals have reared their ugly heads and different administrations have, tried to sell off portions of the Newark watershed. And of course, almost all of the Newark watershed now is protected by a conservation easement through the state of New Jersey Green Acres program that was helped, during the time leading up to the passage of the Highlands Act, it was very important to try to purchase from the city of Newark a conservation easement. So all of the people of New Jersey purchased the development rights in order to better protect this land. This map is an amalgam of all sorts of attributes. The darker the red color, the more resilient the forest is going to be in the face of climate change. So again, it's the same exact location that we see in every slide, Clinton Reservoir, most of the Newark watershed. And here we can see that this is the most resilient forest in New Jersey in terms of not losing its ecological integrity and not losing its natural resource services in the face of climate change. So we have a treasure here that we need to protect. Now, climate change is not really the biggest problem that the Highlands Forest faces. Um, as we lose our coastal areas over the next century, there is going to be tremendous pressure on the land. And the forest fragmentation that results from development of highways and strip malls and residential areas and you name it, is going to put pressure on the Highlands Forest, and in particular, put pressure on Newark and the state of New Jersey and the people of New Jersey to relax some of the protections. And so, in my view, this resilient forest is going to fare rather well in the face of climate change. But unfortunately, the pressures that are going to go forward for the next 50, 75, 100 years are still going to be major threats. And with that fragmentation come all sorts of problems. This map is a map showing the concentration of rare species. And the darker brown color indicates forest areas with the highest concentration of rare species. So once again, Newark, in preserving a water supply for its people, has also protected the natural biological diversity of New Jersey better than almost anywhere else in the state, better than any other agency, better than anyone, because they've kept their forest intact and they have kept the ecological function as pristine as possible. Now, there are many threats, not just the onslaught of civilization and the sprawl that ultimately will put pressure on the forest, but there are other threats. And one of the things that's happening in our New Jersey highlands is that our forests are starting to become mature. Forests get to be very old in the eastern United States. Trees can live 300, 400, 500 years. Not every tree. Many trees only live 70 or 100 years or 150 years. But the trees that survive, the trees that are most suited to every particular microhabitat and fare well in the competition, they can live for centuries. And they provide a tremendous array of microhabitats for all sorts of species, whether it be large animals, insects, fungi, bacteria, all the things that make up the forest that give it its function, and especially in the soil. The forest soils are so important for filtering water, and they depend upon all sorts of invertebrate species, bacteria, fungi, and this living net of organisms that catch the rainwater, filter out pollutants, return all the nutrients back to the living vegetation. And we have threats. Now, as I was saying earlier, this is the same place. This is before a clear-cut logging event, and this is after a clear-cut logging event, not in the Newark watershed, but right nearby. And this was done for a habitat enhancement project for rare species. Now, it's okay to do a few habitat enhancement projects for rare species, but unfortunately, what's happening is some of these projects, we're getting sort of like the aluminum siding salesperson's bait and switch, where we're being told that the forest is overcrowded, it doesn't have any old trees, it's very young, it's not healthy, and so we're going to remove some of these trees to make the forest healthy and promote, various other species. The problem is that a lot of that is not peer-reviewed scientific literature. It's soft literature. There are these groups that are promoting certain agendas, and they indicate in various publications all the benefits of having these clear cuts and young forests. And there are some benefits, but if you actually read these documents, they're not peer-reviewed scientific journals. They often make all sorts of claims that don't bear out in actuality. And it's easy to read these documents and think that they're just wonderful and they're just doing magnificent things and they're going to create all sorts of wonderful habitats. But in the end, many of these projects may not work. So it's okay to do some projects, especially if they're well-founded. But unfortunately, many of them are just sort of a smokescreen for cutting down the big trees. So here's an aerial view of that clear-cut patch. You can see all the boulders and rocks that are left, basically no vegetation. And this area is growing back in young forest, all tiny little trees, and that's fine. But the problem is that the trees that are cut are not young trees or middle-aged trees. They happen to be some of the oldest trees in the forest. So when we go out and measure the trees that are cut, we find that they're not 60 years old or 80 years old or 90 years old. They're actually 120 years old. This tree happened to be 145 years old. And the forest is filled with these trees that are well over a century in age. And we're being told that middle-aged trees are being cut. And in reality, some of the oldest trees in the forest are being cut. And these are the trees that sequester the most carbon and provide a resilience in the face of climate change. Here's a graph showing in green the distribution of tree sizes. On the left are very skinny trees, and going to the right, the larger and larger trees. If you just focus on the green bars, you can see that the forest is composed of trees of all different sizes, many small trees and then a few large trees. Well, then when you look at what was actually cut, the distribution of the trees that were cut is more toward the large end. So we're being told that the young trees are being cut and the middle-aged trees are being cut, but in reality, it's the large trees that are being taken, sort of like a bait and switch. So we have to watch out for that. We have to be careful that when projects are designed, that we're given accurate data and that the projects have a clear benefit and that the organizers of the projects are actually telling us the truth. Another important thing is the difference between the forests that are on old agricultural land and the forests that are on pristine soils. On the left-hand side of this rock wall, here's a rock wall that's probably from the early 1700s or late 1600s. And on the left, it was farmed. And the species diversity on the left in this photo is very poor, very few species. And the understory, the plants growing right on the ground, are mostly invasive species from Europe and Asia. And because the forest soil is ruined by agriculture, and it may be that those areas may never return to a more natural condition where they provide ecological services. They might after centuries and centuries, but certainly not on the time scale that we're trying to preserve the land and preserve biological diversity in the face of the next 50 years in the face of climate change. So we already have this assault on the forest that's already taken place between fragmentation and development and agriculture. And we have already done so much harm to the forest that we cannot afford to make bad decisions in the parts of the forest that have not suffered yet. On the right-hand side of this photo is natural forest. Sure, it was cut over many times by the colonists, but now it's 130 or 40 years old again, and it's filled with native species because the soil was never disturbed and it's performing all of its ecological functions. It's as clear as a bell that these forests on historically undisturbed soils are providing all these services, and we should be doing everything we can to avoid disturbing these forests. Here is a map, not in the highlands, but just south of the highlands of New Jersey from the 1800s, showing how little forest was left. The top part of the picture is Round Valley Reservoir near Interstate 78. This sort of trapezoidal shaped patch of forest in the lower center part of the picture is a county park. And it's one of the oldest patches of forest left in that part of New Jersey. Very large, very old trees filled with rare species of plants in the understory. Some of the rarest plants in New Jersey grow in that forest. Luckily, so when you go and sample a forest like that, you find that it has very high biological diversity. When you sample old forests like the green patches on this map, you find that they have a very high index of forest quality, and that's what's in the next graph. When you sample forests that have grown up on old agricultural lands, you find that they have a lower forest quality index, and that's what's shown on this graph. Many sample sites, nearly 100 sample sites. The red bars are the forest quality going from lowest to highest on the soils that were never disturbed. And the blue bars are the forest quality on the sites that were on former agricultural land. You can see that some old agricultural sites have higher quality than some of the historic forest areas, but on average, they have a much lower quality. So we really need to protect those high quality forests that are growing on historic forest soil. Now, forests basically last forever. Trees get old, they die, they get replaced. And another real big problem in New Jersey right now is the onslaught of overabundant deer. We have changed the landscape so much, and we have provided so many places for deer to feed in suburban landscapes and in agricultural landscapes and in all sorts of disturbed areas alongside highways and roads, that the deer population has skyrocketed, probably to 20 times higher than what the forest evolved with. For every one deer that would have been in New Jersey 500 years ago, there are probably now 20. And the forest can't tolerate this. So instead of the forest being able to regrow and replace itself, what's happening, and this is happening even in the Newark watershed and in the Highlands, is that the lower layer of the forest is disappearing. The deer are just consuming everything, and there are not enough seedlings and saplings and small plants and wildflowers and things that should be covering the forest floor. A forest should be hard to walk through. And the deer are making our forests like savannas, like parks, where you can just walk unimpeded. And that's not a healthy forest. The way they do it is just by eating everything that tries to sprout. And eventually, the root systems can't keep replacing the stalks of the young shrubs and small trees, and eventually they just start to disappear. Now they can recover. This was an empty forest in the mid-1990s, and the deer had eaten everything in the understory. We put up a small fence, and within 5 years, the forest was growing back inside the fence. There are many such examples of this now all over New Jersey, where if you keep the deer out, the forest can recover with native species. And in fact, it recovers with native species and not alien species. Once you establish some shade, notice on the left-hand side of the photograph, it's going to be hard for sunlight to reach the ground because it's going to be intercepted by the leaves of all the young trees and shrubs. Once you establish that shade low down, it's very hard for alien species to grow. There are some that can tolerate that, but it's very difficult. This is a park, that old forest that I was talking about, part of a greenway in Hunterdon County. And again, this was that old forest with big trees and many species of rare plants. And about 9 or 10 years ago, what's normally supposed to happen in an old forest, I'm sorry about that. What's normally supposed to happen in an old forest is that old trees die. They create a little hole in the forest canopy once they lose their leaves and their branches start to fall, and sunlight reaches the ground and the forest can regenerate. Well, of course, with the deer, that's getting very hard for the forest to regenerate in these light gaps. So one of the ideas is to let more light in. If you let a lot of light in, plants can grow more profusely and perhaps the forest can regenerate. The problem is that when you let that light in, it also triggers the invasion of alien species, and it also increases the deer herd. So it's kind of, you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or maybe 1 step forward and 2 steps back by opening up these forests with the idea that more light is going to make them better. So a professor from Raritan Valley College went into the forest with his students to measure and do ecological studies, and he found that all the trees were marked to be harvested, and no one knew about it. The park commissioners didn't know about it. The local mayor didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. It was just the forest was going to be sold right out from under the public. So we have to watch out for these things. In the end, that forest did not get logged. We saved it right at the last minute. And there's just me standing next to one of the giant trees that were all slated to disappear. Not all, but almost every one. And it prompted this comment. A well-managed forest will go on forever, while a forest left to its own devices will die and become useless to anyone. And that was the president of the New Jersey Forestry Association that said that in their publication shortly after this conservation battle. So, you know, that's just complete nonsense. Forests go on forever, and they sequester carbon, and they don't slow down. The recent research is showing that forests don't slow down in carbon sequestration in order to fight climate change until they might be 300 or 400 years old. We're nowhere near that in New Jersey. Our forests are growing as profusely and as quickly as they ever have, especially with the increased rainfall that we've been getting. And so I just want to go over the points on this slide really quickly. Trees accumulate carbon over their entire lifespan. That's hundreds of years. Old forests accumulate carbon and contain vast quantities of it. So old forests are sequestering carbon. Old forests accumulate carbon in the soils. This is really important. Old forests shade the soil, they keep the temperature down, they filter water, and the carbon that is accumulating from their roots and their leaves and the decaying material stays in the soil and builds up, and that's a tremendous source of carbon sequestration. So we're finding out that it's old forests that sequester the most carbon, and if we want to sequester carbon, we should just leave our forests alone. Here's a recent publication called Wild Carbon by Mark Anderson of the Nature Conservancy. And if you were to go to the Northeast Wilderness Trust, you'll find this publication. And it clearly shows that the best thing we can do to sequester carbon in the New Jersey Highlands and the Newark watershed and all of our preserved lands is to leave the forest alone. That's not to say that we can't do little projects for rare species, but we have to be careful that we don't start doing projects just to take out timber under the guise of claiming that we're helping a few rare species. And then this is, you've seen this slide earlier. This is Hutchison Memorial Forest. This forest is, the last time there was a disturbance in this forest was 1595. This is in Somerset County, New Jersey. This forest is almost, well, it's about 425 years old since the last time there was a fire. The forest is there. It's not dying. It's not becoming useless to anyone. It's not going away. It has experienced some problems in the last few decades because of gypsy moths and deer, but the forest is now being managed to try to combat those problems. But the point is that forests last forever. They don't go away. They don't become useless, and we need to protect them, and we need to preserve them, and we need to make careful decisions when we decide that we're going to go and manage a forest. We need to do it properly and carefully, and we need to tell the truth. Here are some resources and references. I'm going to kick it back to Mike Pizarro, and I guess I'll just leave this slide up for a little while because I guess we're going to start a discussion period. I'm not sure how many pages. There's a couple of pages of this, so Mike, you might want to go back and forth and let people take screenshots of this or take notes from these pages.
So we are recording this webinar, and that will be made available after the conference to everyone who registered. We also, I believe, have everyone's slides, which we can make available as well. So you don't necessarily have to take a screenshot, but if you want to, you can. So we have a couple questions. So if so we have a bit of time for questions. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But there was a question, Emil, about whether there was peer-reviewed science that says early successional forests increase diversity.
Yeah, well, early successional forests can have a diverse array of species, yes. And so the Highlands Coalition is a proponent of having patches of early successional forest and keeping them as early successional forest, and picking the right places to do it. And then if you have a series of early successional forest patches, you go in every 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 years, and you keep managing them as young, very, very young early successional forests. What was proposed on many pieces of state land in the last decade or so was to make clearings and let those forests grow for 80 or 100 years. And in fact, there's a Rutgers publication from 2011 that actually advocated managing all of our forests on between an 80 and 100-year rotation, which is absolutely crazy, and not letting our forests, not letting the great lion's share of our forests mature and become incredibly old, and trying to target them as old growth so they can sequester carbon. It used to be thought that if you cut down a forest and you made wood products and you stored all those wood products in houses and structures and all that, you could sequester carbon that way. But recent studies are showing that when you harvest a forest for timber, yeah, you make a few wood products if you're lucky, but mostly the roots decay, the branches decay, most of the tree is left to rot, especially underground, and you don't actually sequester a lot of carbon. Because when everything rots, it releases all the carbon back into the atmosphere. That's what fungi do, and bacteria is they decay the wood and they just reverse the process of photosynthesis. So anything that you leave in the forest, pretty soon it's not there anymore and it's all back in the atmosphere.
All right. Emil, another question for you. So you had a slide, the long-standing debate. Do you have that, what paper that was from?
I'm not sure what the question is. But
so you had a slide with a long-standing debate. Was that?
Oh, well, there's a recent paper. I don't know if it's in our resources and references by an author named Mumaw, and that's the one that's advocating for this technique called proforestation, where we're trying to sequester the maximum amount of carbon, and that can be found in that wild carbon document. That wild carbon document has most of the references that you need. And in fact, there are actually some more recent ones that we can try to make available soon. I've just gathered a few more references in the last few weeks, but they're not included in that wild carbon document.
All right, thank you. All right, throw this one out to all the panelists here. Can you comment on how urban forestry can work within the urban communities of New Jersey, Newark, Patterson, as well as protecting watershed lands upstream? How can forestry take place within the community?
Well, forestry is very important in urban areas, creating heat sinks and places for critters to live. But also, we have to keep in mind. I mean, we should be promoting forestry in our urban areas, planting as many trees as possible. But we got to be careful, because if we're planting trees in urban areas, and meanwhile we're cutting them down in our large forests elsewhere in New Jersey, what have we gained? So we have to be careful that we're maintaining what we have, meanwhile creating new where we can.
I'd like to just add that I'm a bit concerned that nowadays it seems like when we do plantings in urban areas, we're using trees that have been selected for ease of care, and also that they don't grow big, and because I guess perhaps people don't want to have a lot of leaves on the streets and on the sidewalks. So if you drive around New Jersey in some of our older suburbs and in our cities where projects have been done, sometimes it's great. Sometimes you see beautiful red oaks and sycamores and all sorts of beautiful trees that are hickories, shagbark hickories, and things that come from floodplains that are resistant to the difficult city conditions. But many times you see just these ridiculous little trees. Some of them, they're not even native species, and they're never going to get big, and they don't cast much shade. I see a lot of specimens of locust and ginkgo, which is an Asian species. And I mean, they look okay. It's more like landscaping, but they're really not providing any kind of shade or heat, the ability to control the heat island effect. It's really discouraging to see that we're moving away from having streets with beautiful big old trees because of the fact that they're a little bit difficult to manage and a little bit inconvenient.
And I'd like to add on to that. And Emil, that's exactly what we see with the Newark Environmental Commission. And it's been hit and miss. You know, we've had volunteers from this program with Rutgers. We try to start again the Tree Shade Commission, and within Newark, there's also, you know, county parks. You know, you have Weequahic Park and then Riverbank and Riverfront that are county parks, and there's also in terms of the sidewalks, you know, like you mentioned with the big trees. So what happens is because the roots are trying to find water, so they break up the sidewalks. And then because they're also not maintained properly, so sometimes the branches fall, and then, you know, there's also fear of lawsuits from people tripping over the sidewalks. And then, you know, and we only have maybe one arborist, you know, possibly, you know, last time I checked, maybe one, to take care of all these trees and all these issues. And you have people who also do not want those big trees in front of their homes. And so it's a constant struggle, you know, in terms of what it is that we have to do to maintain, and also with you mentioned about the trees, with people planting trees. It, you know, they're starting to plant a lot of red maple trees, and that's one of the trees that you know, that doesn't grow too tall and provide shade. And also trying to educate the kids, you know, the youth, and the people about the forestry, you know, the trees and how to maintain them. So it's a problem that we struggle with. And, you know, and we're not foresters, we're not ecologists, and, you know, we're always trying to find different ways to improve that situation.
Certainly where there's room, for example, you know, in some of the larger parks where you have big grassy lawns and room, you know, we should be planting trees that perform these important ecological services. Obviously, it's difficult where you have a narrow patch of ground between the street and the sidewalk, you know, and it's very difficult. But I'm sure we can do better. Sometimes it seems like we're just sort of, you know, taking the easy way.
Yeah, and we're trying. You know, it's a constant dialogue.
It sounds like, you know, Emil, and when I've read that as we redevelop our cities, we reimagine how that, you know, building street interface actually works and how wide it is. And
Right.
so I guess somewhat two related questions. Should we be, let me try English again. Shall we be replanting trees to replace the trees that were removed from the infestation with Eastern ash borer? And then how does the demise of those trees in the state affect the role of forests, particularly with regard to carbon sequestration? Should this demise be managed?
So that's a long answer, really long answer. So emerald ash borer is going to kill a lot of ash trees, if not all of them, eventually. And we're going to lose a lot of, you know, big, beautiful trees from landscapes, from some parks, from forests. Generally, where you see forests that are dominated by ash, it tends to be on former agricultural soils. One of the hypotheses, you tend to see a forest of dominated by ash, and it's dying wholesale. And underneath all that ash is mostly alien weeds, multiflora rose in particular, and because it's on old agricultural soil. And once the ash trees die, we've seen it actually happen in a few places. Once the ash trees all die, then the multiflora rose is exposed to sunlight, and the multiflora rose gets rose rosette virus when it's living in bright sun, and it dies. And if you do nothing, the multiflora rose skeletons actually protect emerging seedlings and saplings that are going to grow up into a new forest, because they're you know, tangled and thorny. And so we're actually seeing native species come up in the skeletons of rose bushes that have died after the ash trees have died. We've seen that in a couple of places. So it might be, unfortunately, those places are carbon emitters. There was also a question about sequestration in there, where when all these trees die, they're all going to start to rot, and all the pieces are going to rot, and they're going to emit a lot of carbon as they rot. So they're, that's not helping. I would imagine if any of those ash trees were useful, I mean, I know we're removing a lot of ash trees from dangerous areas, long trails and bike paths and that kind of thing, but I don't know if it's worth trying to remove them in the middle of the forest. It might be a great experiment to just leave it all alone and see what happens, and we might end up with some native species coming back. But certainly those areas are going to be emitting carbon into the atmosphere, and it's tragic that we're going to be losing, so many stands of trees. In our more pristine forests, ash trees are not so dominant. They're more scattered. And, when a couple of trees die here and there, and if the deer problem can be tackled, those light gaps will fill up with native species. So, it's probably best to leave them alone and not make roads into the forest. I know sometimes when there are storms in county parks and municipal parks, all of a sudden heavy equipment is brought in to remove everything that falls because it needs to be kept so neat and clean. And, then the heavy machinery that moves through the forest to remove the fallen trees probably does more damage than it's worth removing some of those things. But, it's hard because people like everything to look neat when it's in a park that's visited by people. So there's so many competing interests, and it's very difficult to know what to do sometimes.
Cool. All right. So I understand that the Highlands, so a question, I understand that the Highlands Council recently approved funding for up to $200,000 for a watershed assessment study in the Pequannock watershed in West Milford. Could you please share a little about the scope and objectives?
Probably that's a better question for the Highlands Council. Sorry, Dean, I don't have information on that, but seriously, I'm sure if you gave a call to the Highlands Council, they'd be happy to give you some details about it. I'm with the Highlands Coalition.
All right. So another question, do planting new trees compensate for the carbon emissions from decomposing ashes? Is there a 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 ratio, or?
Well, it depends on what you plant, and it depends on the success that you have when you plant them. One of the problems with climate change is that we tend to have severe droughts. We get a lot of rainfall, but it comes in bunches.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard to keep plantings alive. And also, it's really hard to protect plantings from deer. It's very expensive. Tree tubes sometimes work, but sometimes you plant trees and you put the plastic tree tubes around them, and it doesn't really matter because then the mice and the voles go after the roots of the little trees that you plant. So it's really hard to grow trees. Natural regeneration is probably the best if you have seed sources and if you can protect an area and keep the deer numbers down. Natural regeneration is probably your best bet. Although if you have the volunteers and the resources to plant trees and keep them watered and keep them protected, then obviously you can start to regain your carbon. But it's going to be a while before you could regain all the carbon that's lost. I mean, it's probably over the long haul, 30, 40, 50 years, it probably, it all comes out in the wash between planting trees and also just allowing natural regeneration to take place, unless you can ensure that it works, which is very difficult.
All right. Any closing thoughts? All right. We are at 2:15, so I want to thank the panelists. That was incredibly informative. I always learn when I listen to the three of you. And then, it seems like the better we revitalize our cities, the less pressure we put on our forests, which means the less pressure we put on our water resources and our water supply, and the better off we all are. And DEP, as part of their 2050 climate change report, are looking to use forests as carbon sequestration sinks. So not only are we protecting our water supplies, but we are also having a role in climate change. So again,
I
thank
want
you.
to thank Winnie for being an activist in the great city of Newark. I mean, because of the city of Newark, we have the most spectacular forest in northern New Jersey, which is the Newark watershed. It is truly amazing. People should go and buy their hiking permit from the Newark watershed and go hiking there and experience the place. It is truly amazing. And thank goodness that Newark had the foresight to save all that land and manage it so beautifully for all these over 100 years.
Thank you
Well,
all
Emil,
for what you do also.
maybe you, me, and Winnie can get something going to get a program to get people out and get better acquainted with that watershed to
That's a great
understand
idea.
all the values it provides us.
The city has one, but it needs some help also. Different angle.
All right. Well, I'm happy to help.
Okay. Yeah, we should talk.
All right, panelists, thank you again so much. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you,
For all
Mike.
the attendees, we have two more sessions, both of them at 2:30. We're having helping environmental organizations prioritize and normalize racial justice. And then also at 2:30, gadgets and gizmos. And remember, we are recording all of these, so they will be available. So if you really wanted to go to both, pick one and you can watch the other one later. So again, thank you, and see some of you in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Take care.